Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today. So today we're going to have two speakers, and we're going to be talking about the role of scientists in climate litigation. The first speaker, she's Annalisa Savaresi, and she is an associate professor of international environmental law at the University of Eastern Finland. She has a PhD in law by the University of Copenhagen, and she has many years of experience researching, teaching, and working with environmental law and policy. So I should say that this talk is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our channels later on. So if you want to ask questions at the end of the talk, you're welcome to do it by turning your video on, but also if you're not comfortable with that, you can just type your question in the chat box. And with that, I'm gonna leave the floor and the screen to Annalisa Savaresi. Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Let me unmute myself. Hello, and many thanks for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure to join you for this talk and to address an audience of scientists. Lawyers don't often do that, so it's really nice to have a chance to talk to you. I was tasked to provide you with an introduction on climate change litigation, explain what it is and what we lawyers are doing about it. And then Wim will be talked more in detail about his work as a climate scientist and his input into climate litigation. So our talks should hopefully complement each other quite well. Let me just start by maybe stating the obvious, which is why. Why are we doing this? You, I'm sure, all know that the Paris Agreement was only adopted in 2015 and entered into force actually a few years later. So we've not had the Paris Agreement for very long. Yet climate litigation, I'm sure you know, is spiraling everywhere. And it's all over the world and it's happening increasingly. So why is this the case? Has climate change not been lawyerly enough? Well, the truth is that the architecture created with the Paris Agreement was arguably the best that could be achieved in terms of feasibility or political will. But the reality of it is that there is a lot of trepidation about the implementation of this agreement. And therefore, many activists, but also scientists advocated or started advocating the resort to other means in order to achieve the progress we need to tackle the climate problem. And here you see a quote from 2017 of James Hansen, a scientist that may be famous, that may be known to you already, advocating the resort to litigation in order to address the climate problem. And this is where we are today. I'm sure that many of you may have heard already of the reports that the Grantham Research Centre at the London School of Economics publishes every year, taking a picture of the status of climate litigation worldwide. And this report that I quote in several of my slides provide the following definition of climate litigation. It describes climate litigation as lawsuits that raise questions of law or fact regarding climate science, mitigation, or adaptation. Now, this is already a mixed bag, putting together very many different things. And the picture becomes, from a lawyer's perspective, even more blurred when you consider that not only we are looking at lawsuits, but we are also looking at complaints before non-judicial bodies. And for a lawyer, there is a big difference between these different kinds of fora. But nevertheless, this is what the databases show you. So if you visit the Grantham Research Centre database, or if you visit the similar database that the Sabin Center at Columbia Law School hosts, you will find a lot of data aggregated in a very unselective way, if you like. What is interesting, however, about this data is that it was aimed and designed to capture a phenomenon a phenomenon of litigation that concerns this type of issues. And as you can see from this diagram, this litigation has been increased steadily in recent years, with a spike in the last few since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. This litigation is happening everywhere in the world, increasingly in Europe, but it's fair to say that it started in the United States, where the vast majority of lawsuits are still being brought, but there is a lot of evidence that in common law jurisdictions, there is a lot more litigation than in civil law jurisdictions. And one of the reasons, of course, is culture. There is a greater litigation culture in these countries, but there has also been a lot of activism motivating this sort of litigation. And it's also important that we understand that when we look at the data compiled in the databases, unfortunately, I would have to say, we don't have a lot of granularity in the data, in the sense that the databases compile both anti and pro-climate litigation. What does that even mean? Anti-climate litigation is the litigation that took place largely in the beginning of the history of the data collection. Especially in the United States, there were loads of applicants that litigated against climate action. You can imagine corporate actors, but not only. In the US, for example, some federal states did argue against the adoption of legislation on climate change at the federal level. So the databases actually encompass also this kind of litigation. And I'm sure this is not what you normally think of when you think about climate litigation. You normally think about the litigation that you see in the bottom of the slide, which is the pro-climate litigation, the litigation in support of climate action. And this is what I will be talking more about today, because this is the litigation that has increased in recent years, especially since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, and that is spreading all over the world fast. So anti-climate litigation has been around for a long time, especially in the United States, but it has existed also in Europe for quite some time. But nowadays, we're seeing a lot more pro-climate litigation that is aimed to achieve greater climate action, either in relation to mitigation or adaptation, even though it's fair to say that the majority of litigation worldwide concerns mitigation. So what are the key questions that are being asked in order to unpack and understand litigation of this kind? First of all, we have to ask ourselves, who is bringing this litigation against who? And of course, the main options here are state and non-state actors. By this word, I mean individuals, groups, corporate actors. For what? Litigation can, of course, raise a very large number of questions, but the big difference that I would like to draw your attention to today is the fact that litigation can be argued on the basis of climate law itself, or it can be argued on the basis of other sources of law that are not climate specific, like tort law. Where does the law come from? What is the source of the obligations that we may be litigating in a climate case? And there is, again, a great deal of variety here. We may be talking about litigation that's based on international law, national law, or regional law like EU law. So who is being brought to court by who? As you may not be surprised to hear, the applicants in a large number of climate cases are individuals and groups. But as I mentioned, in the United States, when we were talking about climate litigation, especially in the early days, also companies and local governments were bringing this kind of litigation. Who are these guys suing? Typically states and public authorities, clearly, because these are the bodies that are meant to adopt climate action and therefore are on the receiving end of litigation in most of the cases. However, in recent years, it's fair to say that there has been an increase, modicum increase in the litigation against corporate actors. And I think this is an important point for you to interiorize, because there is a lot of visibility for litigation against corporate actors, but it's fair to say that we're talking about a very small number of cases for now. So you can see here, again, some numbers reported by the Grantham Research Institute. And if you look at the number of cases on the left-hand side, you understand what I'm talking about. Vis-a-vis thousands of cases in the databases, we're talking about a few dozens of cases brought against corporate actors. So it's a growing trend, but very small trend. The majority of climate litigation is brought against states or subnational governments. Where, in which courts is this litigation being brought? Again, we have a number of options: international courts. I'm sure you've heard of the advisory opinion that is being asked of the International Court of Justice, for example. But it's fair to say that this is not litigation proper, because an advisory opinion is not a contentious case. It's just interpretation of the law. So there's no proper international litigation in the contentious sense of the word yet. There is, however, some lawsuits that have been brought before regional courts, before the courts of the European Union, but also before the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court, and so on. There is in some subnational and national litigation, and in fact, this is where the majority of the action is taking place. So it's important that we understand that when we're talking about the phenomenon of climate litigation, we're largely talking about litigation that's taking place at the national level or at the subnational level, before national or subnational courts, but also before informal bodies like national contact points, ombudsmen, national human rights institutions. A vast number of bodies are being asked to consider climate cases. What are the outcomes of this litigation typically? Excluding the US case law, because of the reasons I mentioned, that is that the data aggregates anti and pro-climate cases, and that in the US would bring a distorted picture. The Grantham estimates that the chances of success are fairly large, over 50% in climate cases. And this is, of course, a gross generalization based on the data available. But this is an interesting data for you to consider about the case law. It's also important to understand that some cases may be very impactful in spite of not having been successful. And I will give you a couple of examples later. The most famous climate case to date, I'm sure you've heard of it, is being the Urgenda Foundation court decisions against the state of the Netherlands. I don't have a lot of time to run through this case with you, but I will just provide you some key facts to explain why this case has made such strides. The applicants had asked the Dutch courts to declare the Dutch government had to pursue more ambitious climate targets within the range that you see on this slide. We will say a couple of words about this range in a minute. What is interesting is that this is the first time a court of law was asked to do something like this, because not only did the applicants ask the court to give more ambitious targets to the state than those that the state had itself adopted, but also to order the state to meet such targets and within a specific time frame. The applicants based their requests on tort law, human rights law, and international environmental law. And what happened with this request is really interesting, because against all expectations, the applicants were successful at all degrees of decision. And in the end, the Supreme Court upheld the decisions that were adopted by the lower courts. I will not go into the details of the changing of the reasoning for the court to grant claims of the applicants, You can ask questions if you're interested. What is really interesting for us to consider is the use of climate science by the court, because this is the first time in the judicial history of climate litigation that a court used an IPCC report to identify a target for a state to pursue. And this is the target that the court went for, which was a reduction of 25% of the Netherlands emissions vis-a-vis 1990s levels. And this was not an individualized target that was identified by the IPCC, but was the target that the IPCC at the time had indicated as desirable for developed country parties like the Netherlands. The court also dismissed the objection of the government that the Netherlands was an insignificant actor in the climate crisis because of its small emissions vis-a-vis the global carbon budget. So two important milestones in the judicial history of climate litigation. One is the use of climate science in order to determine targets, and the other one is the fact that the input of the state is not a condition to adjudicate and provide responsibility to reduce emissions. I must, however, warn you that not everyone was impressed with this judgment, and that the Urgenda decisions caused some noise in the academic and non-academic community. As you may not be surprised, here the judges were in the first instance accused of not doing their job properly, because they were saying the judges were replacing the political will of the Dutch people that had been formulated by its legitimate lawmakers by adopting policies and laws that were less ambitious than what the court had prescribed. It was also interesting to listen to the legal debate and the lawyers' debate about the line of argumentation that was followed by the court, but I will not bother with that. You're very welcome to ask me questions later if you're interested in finding out. More pragmatically, the target that was identified by the court later turned out to be insufficient to reach the Paris Agreement temperatures goal and, if you like, be a fair share of the global carbon budget for the Netherlands to comply with. And I'm not saying this very well, but basically the target should have been higher for the Netherlands to meaningfully contribute to its fair share to achieving the temperature goal enshrined in the Paris Agreement. The Dutch courts also did not make use of the latest climate science. Some scientists have lately alleged, and you can see a link in a Nature article making this point. So not everyone was entirely satisfied with Urgenda, it's fair to say. Nevertheless, the reality of the fact is that 48 replica lawsuits have been launched since all over the world, not only in the Netherlands, in fact. Urgenda also triggered the rise of litigation specifically in Europe, and it was followed by an important precedent also set in the Netherlands in the case Milieudefensie against Royal Dutch Shell. I'm sure you've heard of this case. It's a very high-profile case, another milestone in climate history, because this time the plaintiffs, another NGO, attacked a large carbon mayor. And the courts in the Netherlands, at least in the first instance, aligned themselves with the Urgenda court and delivered a similar judgment ordering Shell to reduce its emissions, but an appeal is pending in this case, and we do not know what will happen next. Just a word of caution, don't think that all climate cases are successful. I've already mentioned there is about 50% success rate. There were two very high-profile cases here in Europe that were unsuccessful, the first being the so-called People's Climate case, a case that was brought against the European Union for its first edition of the 2030 package. Interestingly, this case was not successful, but the European Union eventually ended up revisiting the 2030 package. I'm sure you know, through the Fit for 55 package that is presently under approval. And this means that even though the applicants were not successful, the arguments were valid and eventually ended up conditioning the shift in political landscape that brought about the Fit for 55 package in the European Union. The second case instead is an example of litigation against oil and gas field concessions that has been unsuccessful at the domestic level, but is now before an international court, in fact, a regional court, more appropriately speaking, the European Court of Human Rights. This case, therefore, is still pending, and we don't know what the outcome of it might be. So what are my conclusions and future outlook? Litigation is, no doubt, an important tool to address the accountability gap that exists in international and national legislation concerning climate change. And the whole point of the litigation we're seeing right now is that to deliver better legislation. We want better laws, especially at the national level. And this is what Urgenda has delivered. Better climate legislation in the Netherlands, in the specific. However, let me leave you with a word of caution. Litigation is not the solution. We can't litigate our way out of the climate crisis. So litigation is a tool that we have at our disposal, and we are using it because the situation in which we are finding ourselves is extreme. The lawmakers are not doing their job well. The lawmakers are not tackling the climate emergency as they should. We are therefore using litigation to put pressure on the lawmakers to deliver the action we need to tackle climate change. And this is what the Urgenda applicants have done, and many others are trying to do elsewhere in the world. Hopefully they'll succeed. We don't have really much time, but I'm sure you all know that. So with these words of hope, I will leave the floor to Wim. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was great. And now we're going to move to the second talk, and then after that we'll have the question and answer session, if that's okay. So now I'm introducing with Thiery. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it well. He has a PhD in climate science, and he's a research professor at Brugge University of Brussels. So Wim, thank you for joining today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? And great, and you see the screen also, hopefully. Fantastic. Okay, good, yes. So, oh no, you don't. You see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on, or good night, depending on where you are. Yeah, so my name is Thiery. I'm a professor at the University of Brussels in Belgium, focused on climate change and climate extremes and climate change impacts. And the work I would like to present to you now is entitled "The Kids Sound All Right." And when I presented this work recently to my fellow colleagues, a colleague came up to me and asked, "Wim, are your children doing okay?" And I had to say, well, my 2 children are doing just fine. But this presentation is not just about my children, it's about your children and children all over the world. Let me nonetheless start by showing you a picture of one of my children. This is Gaspar, and Gaspar is 0 years old in 2020. And on the other hand, you can see a picture of my mother, and my mother is 60 years old in 2020. Now, maybe I can't really see you, but I would like to ask you, who of you has children? And I guess several of you have children. And before we proceed this presentation, I would like to ask each and every one of you to think of the age of your children in 2020, in case you have any, otherwise the age of some people that are really close to your heart. And if you do that, you can ask a question that looks like this. In my case, will a newborn experience more extreme events than a 60-year-old? And I think you will all agree with me that the answer to this is yes, of course. But then if you ask a second question, that is, sure, but how many more? And then this is a question that, to be honest, we as climate scientists and climate impact models have to acknowledge that this is something that we hadn't really quantified until recently. Now, I think this is a really important question to ask for at least 3 reasons. The first reason is that we've seen a surge in recent years in youth taking the streets and organizing climate change, demanding more climate action. These young people from all around the world have been organizing school strikes, worldwide climate demonstrations, and recently even hunger strikes to demand more ambitious climate action. At the same time, governments are failing to meet the targets which they have put forward themselves in international agreements such as the Paris Agreement. If you look at current pledges of countries worldwide taken together, we are heading towards 2.4 degrees of global warming by the end of this century. And if you look at the actual policies instead of these pledges that are written down in the NDCs, we are heading towards 2.7 degrees of warming by the end of this century, which is in both cases way more than what the same countries have agreed in the Paris Agreement, which is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And because of this, we are currently facing the risk that the climate crisis is turning into an intergenerational conflict whereby young people will face, are not in key positions today to make decisions to reduce our emissions, while they will face the consequences. And on the other hand, you have the people that are in the key positions in society and that have the possibility to make the changes, that these people won't face the consequences of their decisions, or should I say, a lack of decision making. Now, a second reason why this is an important question to ask is the recent surge in climate change litigation. And as Annalisa was already explaining, we have seen a surge in these cases in recent years, whereby countries are suing, whereby individuals or NGOs are suing their governments or fossil fuel companies, including the carbon majors. And this suing is typically done either for their lack of sufficient ambition in terms of climate change mitigation or adaptation, or on the other hand, their contribution to observed historical or present day impacts. And then we are looking at the context of detection attribution, which is then an important field of climate science, which is coming into play here. Now, what is interesting is that many of these, several of these recent cases have been filed by young people. And the picture that you see here is the example of the Duarte case, where 6 young people, children from Portugal, are suing 33 countries, including all countries from the European Union, claiming that these children are then claim that the lack of sufficient climate ambition and climate action from these countries is violating their rights as human beings and as children. Now, in this context, it's also asking whether a 15-year-old will experience more climate impacts compared to another generation is also an important legal question, because if the answer to that is yes, that young person may also potentially be more entitled in a better position to start a lawsuit. And the third reason why it's an important question to ask is the scientific reason. It's the nerd reason, and that's because this question links to the distinction between the Eulerian and the Lagrangian perspective, which is a very common perspective in atmospheric sciences, but not at all on the radar of climate scientists and impact scientists. And let me very quickly explain what this difference is using this sketch here. We have, first of all, Mr. Euler, and Mr. Euler is standing on the bridge, measuring the temperature of the water as it evolves over time. And Mr. Euler finds that water temperatures are rising at 2 degrees per hour. And then we have Mr. Lagrange, and Mr. Lagrange is sitting in a boat in the river, measuring water temperatures and finding that these water temperatures are decreasing at 1 degree per hour. Now, both of them are correct in their findings. The difference is the perspective here. We have the Eulerian perspective, which is a fixed location in space, measuring the evolution over time, while the Lagrangian perspective is a perspective where one moves along the flow and measures the evolution in space and time of a given quantity. And as I said, this is very common in atmospheric science, but in climate science, we don't really do this typically. In climate science, we typically measure the evolution of some climate change indicator over time. For example, the land area annually exposed to extreme heat waves, and here heat waves, I define them as a 1 in 100-year heat wave event in a world without climate change under pre-industrial control climate. And you can see that in the historical period, this area has been gradually increasing to about 15% of the global land area facing extreme heat wave nowadays. And in climate science, we then use future projections with climate models or climate impact models to project how this may change under a range of potential future scenarios. And in this case, for example, using 4 global climate models at GCMs, we find that on a 1.5 degree compatible pathway, about 20% of the land area will be annually affected by extreme heat waves by the end of this century. Under a 2 degree pathway, this is 30%. And then the current policy pledges that bring us to 2.4 degrees of warming by the end of this century. More than 40% of the global land area will be annually exposed to an extreme heat wave. Now, the problem with this type of analysis is that it does not allow us to say what climate change means today for a real person living in a real location. Or a 60-year-old who was born in 1960 and will on average live until the 2030s, or for a newborn who will on average live until beyond the end of this century, and who will therefore live to see the day when one of these potential future scenarios becomes a reality. Now, in the study that I'm presenting to you today, we calculated the total number of extreme heat waves that a person will experience across their lifetime. And we find that the 1960 birth cohorts, or people that are 60 years old in 2020, will on average experience 4 extreme heat waves across their lifetime. And we find that this number is very much independent of the future scenario, which is followed. If we look at newborns on the 1.5 degree warming trajectory, we find that they will experience 17 extreme heat waves. This is more than 20 under a 2 degree pathway. And under current pledges, newborns will experience 30 extreme heat waves, according to our heat wave definition. Now, the problem with this is that these absolute numbers that I just gave you are dependent on the heat wave definition. If we would have used a 1 in 10-year heat wave instead of a 1 in 100-year heat wave, those numbers would be very different. So what we do to overcome this problem is to look at relative differences between generations. And we look at how much more heat waves you will experience compared to a reference generation. And if we take the 1960 birth cohort as reference generation, we find that by design, per definition, that generation will experience as many heat waves as themselves. But we then find that on a 1.5 degree pathway, newborns will experience 4 times more extreme heat waves compared to the 1960 birth cohort. This is 6 times more on the 2 degree pathway. And under current pledges, grandchildren will face 7 times more extreme heat waves compared to their grandparents. Now, in this study, we did this for every generation born between 1960 and 2020 in every country of the world. And if you do that, you can draw a diagram which has birth year or age in 2020 on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the exposure multiplication factor, so the increased exposure for lifetime lifetime heat wave exposure compared to this reference generation. Now you see that these 3 lines for the 3 scenarios, they lie on top of each other for the people that are between 40 and 60 years old, which means that there is very little effect of the scenario on their lifetime exposure. But these lines, they start to diverge for younger generations, and the difference is strongest for the newborns. Now, if we develop these results by combining 5 data sets, 2 climate data sets and 3 demographic data sets, I won't go into the details, but we use global scale impact projections, temperature pathways from the 1.5 degree report, and then gridded population, life expectancy data, and cohort size data that are available in public databases. Now, if you've ever looked at an IPCC report, you might have seen graphs that look like this. These are the so-called burning embers diagrams that give the risk as a function of the global mean temperature increase, which you see here on the y-axis. In this example, we're looking at the risks from wildfires. And you can see these 4 colors, which representing in white, no risk, in yellow, detectable, moderate risk, in red, high risk, and in purple, very high risk. And you see the global mean temperature levels at which these risk level transition to a higher level. And I was fortunate to be part of the team that developed these burning embers for the IPCC land report. And some of these embers, including the wildfire one, was also taken up in the synthesis report, which came up last month. And for those interested in burning embers, I invite you to have a look at the review paper, which we did on this topic. Now, but why am I saying this here? We are actually inspired by this figure to see if we can develop something similar within our Lagrangian framework. And to do this, we could not limit ourselves to these 3 scenarios, which I've shown you on the previous slide, but we had to do the analysis on a range of scenarios that covered a whole potential 2100 warming levels. And that's why we repeated this analysis now for all of these great trajectories that you see here on this right-hand graph. And if you do that, you can construct a graph which has, again, age on the x-axis, but now has global warming level in 2100 on the y-axis. And now you have this 2-dimensional space, which you can fill with your exposure multiplication factors. And if you do that, this is the result. Now, for each combination of age and global warming level in 2100, you can find a color, and on the color bar, you can find out how many more extreme heat waves that generation will experience. And I should say now, this is no longer relative to the 1960 birth cohort, but this is now relative to a hypothetical generation living in a world without climate change. Now, if we look at just one example, if we take the upper right corner, newborns under 3.5 degrees of warming, we find that this generation will experience 44 times more extreme heat waves compared to living in a world without climate change. And I invite you now to look up for the person or your child or grandchild or a person close to your heart, find out how many more extreme heat waves this generation will experience under a particular warming scenario. Now, thanks to the ISIMIP scenarios, we can do this not only for heat waves, but in total, we can do this for 6 extreme event categories, including wildfires, crop failures, droughts, river floods, heat waves, and tropical cyclones. For heat waves, you've seen the results already, and we can now draw up the same diagrams for the 5 other categories. Note that the color axis goes from 1 to 30 for heat waves, but it goes from 1 to 4 for all the other extreme event categories. Now, what you see when you look at these graphs is a very clear pattern emerging, whereby the younger you are and the higher the global warming level, the more extreme events you will experience across your lifetime. You also see that there is in general very little color difference for the oldest generations, for example, 55 years or older. You can see very much color difference in the vertical, which means that the global warming level has very little influence on their lifetime extreme event exposure. But the more you go to younger generations, the stronger the color difference in the vertical. In other words, the younger you are, the more the global warming level matters for your lifetime extreme event exposure. Now, if we take again one example point on these graphs, let's take the generation of my oldest son. This is Loic, and Loic was 6 years old in 2020. Under a 3-degree warming pathway, this generation will experience twice as many wildfires, twice as many tropical cyclones, 3 times more river floods, 4 times more crop failures, 5 times more droughts, and 36 times more heat waves. You also see these gray lines here in this diagram. And these are, I'm not going to the technical details here, but if you're above or to the right or this gray line, you will live what we call an unprecedented life. This means that it's not possible to experience that many extreme events across your lifetime if there would not have been climate change. Now you see that there is no gray lines in the middle column for crop failures and heat waves. This is because for those two extreme event categories, every generation born since 1960 will live an unprecedented life in terms of heat wave and crop failure exposure under every level of global warming. If you're under 40, you will in addition live an unprecedented life in terms of drought and river flood exposure, and this even under the most ambitious climate scenarios limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, the results I've shown you so far were for the global average, and in the remainder of my presentation, I would like to zoom in into regional differences. And you can do the analysis at the regional scale also. And if we look at this regionally, we find that there is one region which clearly stands out, and that's the Middle East and North Africa. We now combined these 6 extreme event categories into one, and we then find that people under 25 in the Middle East and North Africa will face at least 7 times more extreme events under current pledges compared to living in a world without climate change. And newborns in that region will face at least 9 times more climate extremes across their lifetime compared to a world without climate change. And this is under the current policy pledges. The second most hit region for young children is the green line, which is sub-Saharan Africa. And you can already see that there is a pattern emerging. And this is even more pronounced if we group countries not by geographic region, but by income. If we do that, we find that young people in low-income countries are facing by far the strongest increases in lifetime extreme event exposure. Now, this is problematic for 3 reasons. First of all, these young people in low-income countries contributed the least to the problem because they emitted hardly any greenhouse gases. Second, these people are amongst the most vulnerable when it comes to exposure to extreme events translating into actual impacts on their lifetime. They often live in families depending on agriculture, and they live in houses that offer poor protection against heat waves and tropical cyclones, for example. And third, there are today a lot of children that are being born in those hard-hit countries. Let me illustrate this with this schematic. If you were born in 1960, you had about 25% chance of being born in a high-income country, as you see in the dark color here. And you had very little chance of being born in a low-income country. Now, this already starts to change for the 40-year-olds, and it's even more pronounced for the newborns. If you're born today, you have only about 10% chance of being born in a high-income country, but you have 2/3 of chance of being born either in a low or lower middle income country. And these are the most hard-hit regions. If we draw up now our exposure multiplication factors as distance from the center of these concentric circles, we can quantify for each region the multiplication factors under different scenarios. And if you do that against the 1960 birth cohort, this will be ×1 per definition, of course. But you can then also do this for the other birth cohorts. And if we look at the newborns, you find that newborns in low-income countries will experience at least twice as many river floods under 1.5 degree warming pathway, at least 3 times more river floods under a 2 degree pathway, and 4 times more river floods under current pledges compared to the 1960 birth cohort. And the second most hit region, as you can see here, are the lower middle income countries with 3 times more river flood exposure under current pledges. Now, to give one more statistic, if we look at all children between 2015 and 2020, there were 64 million children born in Europe and Central Asia, and this includes my middle son, Leon. And those 64 million children, they will face 4 times more climate extremes under current pledges compared to a world without climate change. But in the same period, 206 million to 205 million children were born in sub-Saharan Africa. And those 205 million children, they won't face a fourfold, but a sixfold increase in lifetime extreme event exposure. So not only does the average child experience more extreme events, there's also many more children in those regions experiencing those strong increases. Now, you might be thinking by now that we're all doomed when you see these results. But if there's one message that I would like you to take home from this work, is that this is not the case. And I'm going to illustrate this with these global maps, which illustrate the work is done at the country scale, but that show here for lifetime heatwave exposure under current pledges, dark red colors everywhere, which means that under current pledges, newborns will experience far more heat waves compared to 60 years old, and that this is the case in every country in the world. However, if you draw the same map for the 1.5 degree warming pathway, you can still see red colors everywhere, so still increased exposure for young generations. But you also see that the colors are now much lighter compared to the left map. This means that in every country of the world, there is a benefit of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in terms of lifetime heatwave exposure. We calculate that increasing ambition and limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees instead of the 2.4 degrees reduces the intergenerational burden on young generations by 40% for heat waves and between 10 and 30% for the 5 other extreme event categories. And so from this, we can only conclude that we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees to safeguard the future of current young generations. Now, the results of this study were published in a paper in Science in 2021. And at the same day, there was also a report by Save the Children, which came out, which links these results from our scientific analysis with interviews of people, children in hard-hit regions, and also gives some concrete policy advice. This study also got quite a lot of media attention in international media. And yeah, I can say it's a bit of a weird experience when a journalist calls you and tells you that he or she had to cry when they read your paper, and it happened multiple times for this one. So this was quite an experience. And my favorite interview, which I did probably for this paper, was the interview which I did on Al Jazeera when the people from Al Jazeera called me and they asked me to do an interview at 11 o'clock at night. I was a bit surprised and I asked, yeah, but this is 2 o'clock at night for you. Why would you do this even? Why would you have even interviews at that time? And they said, well, no, but this is prime time for us. So I was a bit surprised to hear that, but I said, okay, let's go. So we went in with my colleague from Save the Children, and we did this interview. And I think you maybe feel that you maybe agree with me that actually this looks quite professional when you look at this. But then this was the reality of me delivering this interview, the behind the scenes, and you can see, well, well, I can say that I'm probably one of the few people in the world that have been in their pajamas on Al Jazeera, and you can also see my youngest son who was there in the middle of the night refusing to go to sleep. So as a conclusion, I would like to invite you to surf to this website, or you can scan the QR code or visit this website. I will leave you a little bit of time to scan this, but otherwise you can just surf to the website myclimatefuture.info. And if you do that, you get to the website where you can enter your birth year, the warming trajectory, and your region, and then you can immediately find out how many more extreme events you will experience across your lifetime compared to a world without climate change. And if you have children, I recommend you to enter their details as well in here. And in addition to just querying the data, you can also use one of these share buttons and to directly post this information on your social media and help to contribute to climate change awareness using this tool. Now, if there's one thing that we can also take home from this, is that from this type of work, is that I think we have to put intergenerational equity at the heart of our climate change communication. And the IPCC has very clearly understood this and made this element very prominent in the latest synthesis report. In their first figure, you have this panel, which is clearly showing the 3 different generations and how the warming stripes overlay with these generations. And now I would like to, at the end of my talk, return to the main theme of today, which is climate change litigation. And we go back to our 6 Portuguese children, and this case has been fast-tracked in the European Court of Human Rights. And on 27th of September, there will be court hearings in Strasbourg. And what is interesting about this is that, and this was new to me, but it turns out to be quite common in lawsuits, is that third parties can intervene in a case. And in this case, there was an intervention last December by a consortium of 40 national human rights institutions. And this European network of national human rights institutions, they did an intervention, a 10-page document where they gave additional arguments for the judge to consider. And one of these elements which they put forward in their report is that under current pledges, a person born between 1999 and 2012 in Portugal will experience at least 24.9 times more heat waves and at least 1.8 times as many wildfires compared to a world without human-induced climate change. Now, I think from what I've been telling that you can guess where this information is coming from. And indeed, we have been doing those calculations on the request of this organization. You can also see another important number is that between 1991 and 2018, 27.7% of all heat-related deaths in Portugal were attributable to human-induced climate change. And this is coming from the landmark paper of Annalisa Savaresi, published in 2021 in Nature Climate Change. And you can see the point I want to make here is that climate science is fundamental for supporting this type of cases. And when we come to realize the important role of climate science when it comes to climate change litigation, I identify 4 roles that climate scientists can play in climate change litigation. And this is the first role here. It's the role of amicus curiae, where you perform a third-party intervention, or you support a group doing a third-party intervention, which means that you're fully independent of the plaintiffs, but you bring scientific evidence to the court for the judge to consider. A second role for climate scientists is plaintiff support. Let me take you to Belgium, where the Klimaatzaak, this is actually the second case, national climate case that was brought against governments after the Urgenda case in the Netherlands. And in this case, more than 67,000 Belgians are suing the Belgian governments, and we have multiple, as you might know, for their lack of sufficiently ambitious climate action. And in first instance, these plaintiffs have won the case, and the judge said even that the lack of ambition is causing a violation of human rights of these plaintiffs. But the judge is not imposed. The judge did not impose quantitative targets, and this is why these plaintiffs, even though they won the case, they went into appeal. And later this year, in the fall of this year, we will have the hearings in the appeal case. Now, in preparation of this appeal, the lawyers of this case approached my friend Thiery, who is a climate scientist working at Imperial College London, and asked whether he could calculate what would be the emission cuts that Belgium would need to do in order to be compliant with the 1.5-degree carbon budget. And Thiery did those calculations in a report which he published from the Grantham Institute at Imperial College, and showed in this report that Belgium would have to increase its emissions by 61% by 2030 if it aims to be carbon neutral in 2042. And it will have to reduce its emissions by 69% if it by 2030 if it aims to be carbon neutral in 2050. And this is now data which is being used in this lawsuit. Now then we go to Switzerland, where 12 Swiss tennis players went into the lobby of Credit Suisse and started playing tennis in this lobby. These were, of course, climate activists, and they were putting the attention to the fact that Credit Suisse, as the main sponsor of Roger Federer, has still been funding fossil fuel projects after signing the Paris Agreement in the last few years. Now, Credit Suisse went ahead and sued these tennis players, and these tennis players got into trouble. But I heard that Credit Suisse is now also themselves into trouble, if you've been following the news lately. But what the point I want to make here is that when there was the hearing of this case, the court called upon my postdoc supervisor, Sonja Seneviratne from ETH Zurich, my former postdoc supervisor, to testify in the case as an expert witness. And when she did that, when she was questioned for more than 1 hour in the court by the judge about climate change, she was heavily building on the IPCC reports that have been appearing in recent years. And so this is the third role that you can play, is being as an expert witness active in these cases. And then finally, I would like to take you to Peru, where a glacier has been is melting, and the meltwater is filling up a glacial lake, which is dammed by a moraine. And downstream of this glacial lake, we have a town of 12,000 inhabitants, including one Peruvian farmer living there. And this Peruvian farmer is now suing RWE, which is a carbon major and which is Germany's largest greenhouse gas polluter. And the Peruvian farmer is asking this company to pay for 0.5% of the costs that are required to protect, to build additional protections and to prevent this lake from flooding and creating a glacial lake outburst flood, which would threaten the entire city. And he asks for 0.5% of the costs to be paid by this company, because this company is responsible for 0.5% of cumulative emissions. And what is interesting, I mean, I can say that RWE is very scared and they're putting their best lawyers on the case. And the judges even went to Peru to visit the glacier. So this is a very high profile case. But what is really interesting here is that at the time when this case was pending, there was a paper that came out in Nature Geoscience, led by the Oxford Attribution Group, which actually found that, which actually stated, and you brought evidence, that the melting of this glacier is entirely attributable to human-induced climate change, and that anthropogenic climate change has dramatically increased the risks of a GLOF, a glacial lake outburst flood, in this particular region. And so this brings me to the fourth role that climate scientists can play in terms of climate change litigation, and that is to perform litigation-relevant science. These authors have never had any contact with the lawyers, with the plaintiffs, but they just heard in the media that this case was happening and decided to perform research, scientific analysis, which is relevant for this case. And I think this is a very promising role for us scientists to do, because it's really very much in our comfort zone. It's what we are good at. It's performing scientific analysis and publishing papers. That's what we do. That's what we are good at. And so if we can just select our questions in the context of ongoing lawsuits, we can actually make a difference while remaining within our role as independent scientists. And if we put out the paper, well, we can be sure that the paper will be used because these plaintiffs, they will notice this paper when it comes out. And on that note, I thank you for your attention. I'm very happy to take any questions if you have any.
Well, thank you very much to both our speakers. Now, I'm aware that it's already an hour. Do you both have time for questions, or is one of you in a rush to leave? So we start with one of you.
Yeah, I do need to leave in like a couple of minutes, like 5 minutes or so, unfortunately. I don't know, Annalisa, how it's with you.
I have a bit of time. So
Okay.
Any questions for Wim should go first.
Okay, so there was a question for Wim by Nick Brooks. Nick, would you like to ask yourself, or shall I? Okay, so the question is, we talked about decision makers' actions or lack of actions. I'd say that failure to adequately address climate change is not simply a failure to act, but it's a very conscious decision and active policy position associated with a de facto policy goal of warming the world by somewhere in the region of 3 degrees by the end of the century. Governments are aware of the consequences of their policies, which include support for the expansion of fossil fuel extraction and related infrastructure and the rejection of readily available mitigation actions and measures. They have signed up to the Paris targets, so this is not simply ignorance or inaction, but a deliberate choice. My question, does framing climate inaction as a deliberate policy choice driven by a desire to political and financial gain rather than a simple failure to act have any legal implications, and by extension implications for how litigation can be used to hold governments and other actors to account?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Nick, for this question. I think indeed, I think when you speak to policymakers, I increasingly have the feeling that they know what is at stake and that they know the importance of climate change mitigation, and that they are aware with what impacts are coming up. So, I mean, maybe this will not be the case 10 years ago, but I think if you go to ministers today, like really at the level where like high level policymakers, they increasingly understand what is at stake, and they are being briefed about IPCC reports and so on. Not everyone knows it as deep as they should. I think there is still a need to educate the policymakers, but I think they are increasingly aware. So why are they not doing it? Yeah. So this was it's interesting when a Belgian high level politician at some point said, every politician knows what measures to take to tackle climate change, but no politician knows how to get re-elected after they've taken those measures. And I think this kind of summarizes it. They are really afraid of the pushback that taking climate change mitigation measures will take, and they are really. I think this is one of the elements why we are not seeing sufficient climate action these days. So I don't know if this a bit answers your question, but it then has legal implications. Well, yes, you can just. Well, I would say you would sue the states not based on their narrative, on their discourse. You just sue the countries based on their actual policies on the field. So you need data. So that would be. I'm not sure if this is basis for litigation, but that's my take. Yeah.
Can I elaborate on what Wim just said there for a minute? I would just like to say to Nick that what you are asking really is climate change lawful, especially when states know. And the answer is not clear-cut. If you ask the courts that deliver the urgenda judgments, they say it is unlawful. Many other courts around the world have not answered the same question the same way. And this really is a matter of bad law. We don't have legislation in place right now that provides a clear-cut answer to that question. Or rather, we have a fluid understanding of the answer to that question. And this is not good. For tackling the climate crisis, we want legislation that absolutely makes it unequivocal. It's unlawful to get a certain degree of climate change. We don't have that law yet. We are in the process of forcing lawmakers to adopt that kind of legislation. They use an example of a group of developed countries that was pushed into adopting more ambitious climate action. It's late, better late than never. But I flagged in my answers to one of the questions a report that was prepared at the Grantham Institute earlier this year that exactly scopes the future of climate litigation vis-a-vis the Fit for 55 reforms that are being carried out in the EU. So we are about to see a change in climate litigation, and we're seeing already a change in climate litigation in countries that already have legislation that is more ambitious, because the question is, bluntly put, what if the targets are good enough, but they're still not being met? What happens then? there is a role for litigation there too. And climate litigation is not going to go away anytime soon. It's going to go in many more directions than we've seen so far. A lot of litigation is urgent style, and this is very important, but we're seeing a lot more happening.
Thank you.
I'm
you very
afraid I
much.
have to slowly drop out, so I don't know if there's any final burning question from me or.
I think it's okay. I know it's already 10:09 for 10 past the hour.
But yes,
Thank you very much again, Pim.
Meeting waiting. Yeah, thanks everyone. It was nice talking to you. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Yes, and Annalisa, I will be reaching out to you because I have something to discuss with you. But we'll reach out via email. Yes. Okay. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks everyone, and yeah, good luck. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so Annalisa, can I ask some questions that have been written in the chat?
Yes, I've already answered a couple of them, but I'm happy to elaborate if you like.
No, so I saw one that I think it's meant to you from Santiago. It says, recently in Switzerland, some cantons or regions wanted to implement public transportation that was free on the point of use, but the policy was deemed unconstitutional and thus prohibited from being implemented. What would the sensible course of action for the population be in this case to change this outcome?
So as I replied in the chat, litigation scenarios and opportunities really depend on national legal culture and jurisprudence. And Swiss lawyers, therefore, are best equipped to answer a question of this kind. But if you're serious about litigation on this, Santiago, the best course of action is to reach out to the organizations that have supported the Clima Seniorinem case that Wim has mentioned, and I posted a link to their campaign page on the chat. What is important for scientists to understand is that litigation is happening strategically in many cases, which means there is a large number of NGOs that are coordinating internationally and bringing lawsuits where it is expedient to do so. So they are doing an analysis of where is it easier to win. And this is why so many cases have been brought in the Netherlands. For example, the Netherlands has courts that are historically favorably looking upon progressive demands from applicants. Other courts, like the Nordic countries, counterintuitively, are much more conservative and less likely to deliver progressive judgments. So it's useful to have those conversations with those involved, because not everything is good for litigation.
Thank you. Sorry, I haven't seen you had replied to that one. I apologize.
It's
does anybody else have a question for Annalisa? So I had a question, just very basic. Do you know if there are more litigations ongoing against governments or against corporations at the moment or historically?
As I mentioned in my presentation, the vast majority of climate litigation is brought against states. And this is normal. It's normal because even though emissions don't come from the state themselves, states have a duty to regulate against climate change as against any other harmful activity in society. This is what we expect of states. So this is why they are the main target. And it's also easier to litigate against states because they have more obligations, duties of care towards us, their citizens. And this is why litigation is going that way.
Thank you. So I think if there are no more questions, we can finish the talk.